Okay, let's kick things off. The whole landscape of cannabis laws in the U.S., it's just incredibly complicated.
Oh, absolutely. A complete patchwork is the right word.
Yeah, 50 states, territories, everyone's got different rules, different restrictions.
Different levels of legality, sometimes changing year to year.
Exactly. And trying to navigate that, especially if you're looking for cannabis for, medical
It
reasons.
can feel almost impossible.
Right, especially if you're in a state where things are still really restricted, or maybe it's not even legal medically at all.
And that complexity, it's just a massive barrier for people who genuinely think this could help them.
Totally. Even in states that do have medical programs, the rules can be so narrow.
Yeah, the qualifying conditions often leave a lot of people out, feeling like they have no options.
Right. So you can imagine when we stumbled across this particular source, well, it definitely caught our attention.
It's a report about an organization called Canense.com.
And they make this claim that's, well, it's pretty extraordinary. Some might even say audacious.
It's definitely bold.
They're saying they can help people in all 50 states get legal access to medical cannabis.
And get this, have it shipped right to their door.
Yeah, shipped.
Which, immediately raises questions given the current state and federal landscape.
Yeah.
It pushes against the common understanding.
It really does. So that's our mission for this deep dive. We want to unpack how they say they do this.
What are the actual steps involved? What's the mechanism?
And what are these legal arguments they're using? Because some of them are surprising, maybe even highly contested.
Definitely not the standard interpretations you hear every day.
And crucially, what could this whole approach mean for someone out there looking for different treatment options, no matter where they live in the U.S.?
We'll dig into the process they lay out, these sort of fascinating constitutional law interpretations they use.
And the health benefits they claim this whole system provides, based on their report anyway.
It might make you rethink some basic assumptions about cannabis access in this country.
Absolutely. Get ready.
Okay, so this group, Canense, they describe themselves not as a typical dispensary, for-profit.
Right. They call themselves a medical cannabis collective.
A collective, yeah. And specifically a national collective. That's key.
And their whole system seems designed to be streamlined, aiming to reach patients everywhere, all 50 states.
The core idea, the sort of linchpin, seems to be leveraging a specific California law.
Which one?
California's Compassionate Use Act, Prop 215, from back in 1996.
Okay, the original medical cannabis law there.
Exactly. And their reading of it is that this law allows anyone, not just California residents, but anyone, to join a California medical cannabis collective if they have a doctor's recommendation.
Okay, hold on. So the first step in their model is becoming a California patient under California law.
Through their collective.
Even if you physically live in, I don't know, Alabama or Idaho.
That seems to be the idea.
But how do you get that California doctor's recommendation without actually going to California? That seems like a hurdle.
That's where telemedicine comes in. It's crucial to their model.
Okay.
They connect patients, wherever they are, with board-certified California doctors through online video calls.
So like a Zoom call with a doctor in California?
Pretty much. And they argue that certain provisions linked to the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, which aimed to expand healthcare access, basically gave these telemedicine visits legal parity, made them equivalent to in-person visits, at least for getting medical recommendations in certain situations.
Interesting. So telemedicine closes that geographical distance.
Right.
You do the online visit with the California doc. You get the recommendation based on your symptoms. And that piece of paper lets you join Canense under that California Compassionate Use Act.
Making you effectively a California medical cannabis patient, but specifically within the structure of their collective.
Right, within their specific framework.
Okay,
so what happens after you join?
Well, once you're approved, they say it's usually quick, like a business day and not very expensive.
Right.
You get access to their online store.
Which they call their apothecary.
Yeah, their apothecary. And here's the really big claim. They say Canense then legally ships the medical cannabis from that apothecary directly to your home.
Anywhere in the U.S.
Anywhere in the U.S. That's the claim.
Okay. Right there. That's the part where I imagine a lot of listeners are probably, scratching their heads, maybe saying, hold on a minute.
Understandably.
Shipping something that's still illegal federally, even if states allow it medically, sending it across state lines, especially into states where it's totally illegal.
How do they justify that?
Yeah, how? This is where their legal arguments must get really interesting and, well, pretty creative.
It is quite something. They lean really heavily on the U.S. Constitution, specifically Article 4, Section 1.
A full faith and credit clause.
That's the one.
Okay, I've heard of that. But isn't that usually about things like states recognizing driver's licenses from other states? Or marriage certificates?
Yeah, that's the common context, yeah, like your Virginia driver's license being valid in Maryland.
Yeah. How do they possibly apply that to medical cannabis, where the state laws are often in direct conflict?
Well, their argument, as presented in the source, goes like this. The clause says each state has to give full faith and credit to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state.
Right.
Their interpretation is that this means if you, living in, say, Tennessee, become a member of Canense, and you are fully compliant with California's Compassionate Use Act through their program,
Okay.
then Tennessee is constitutionally required to honor your specific status as a legal California patient under that act through that collective.
Wow. So they're saying Tennessee has to respect your individual patient rights established under California law via this collective, even if Tennessee law itself forbids medical cannabis.
That's the core of their full faith and credit argument. They're saying the state has to recognize your legally established status based on California's act because the Constitution says so.
That's a very bold interpretation of full faith and credit in this context. Powerful, if it holds up.
It is. And the source does acknowledge, that legal opinions are divided on this. It says there's more to their argument, but full faith and credit is kind of the meat and potatoes, as they put it.
The main course.
Yeah. They stress it's not about Tennessee having to adopt California's law generally. It's about Tennessee having to respect the legal status of a specific person who followed the rules of that California law through Canense's structure.
Okay. But even with that argument, what about the feds? And just the practicalities of shipping. Mailing something federally prohibited seems risky.
Right. How do they deal with potential federal intervention or even state police stopping a delivery truck or seizing a package?
Exactly. There must be another layer to their legal strategy for the shipping part.
There is. They bring in another piece of the Constitution, the Commerce Clause.
Article 1, Section 8. Gives Congress power to regulate interstate commerce.
Precisely. And again, it's their interpretation of this clause that's key.
How do they interpret it differently?
They argue that the original meaning of regulate, back when the Constitution was written, wasn't to control or prohibit, like we often think today.
Okay.
They claim it meant more like to make regular or even to encourage the free flow of. Think, smooth out the process of trade between states, not stop certain trade.
So a completely different emphasis. Not Congress controlling trade, but Congress facilitating it.
That's their historical argument. And applying that original meaning, federal prohibition might not even be a valid exercise of the Commerce Clause power, in their view.
That's a challenge to a lot of established federal power right there.
It is. But they also add another layer related to the Commerce Clause. They argue it primarily applies to states or entities acting for states, not necessarily to individual citizens acting privately.
And Canense positions itself as a collective, a nonprofit.
Exactly. They argue that because they're structured as a nonprofit collective, not a standard for-profit business selling goods,
their activity might not even be commerce in the sense the Constitution regulates. It's more like members sharing resources within a private group.
That's part of their argument, too.
Okay, so let me see if I've got this straight. They're layering these arguments. Full faith and credit requires states to recognize your patient status obtained via their California collective.
Yeah.
Then, a specific historical interpretation of the Commerce Clause plus their nonprofit collective status supposedly means shipping between members isn't prohibited interstate commerce that Congress can block.
That summarizes the core legal pillars they describe. It's definitely a complex legal tapestry they've woven.
And they connect this to an even broader, more fundamental right, don't they?
They do. They bring up the Ninth Amendment.
Which says that just because some rights are listed in the Constitution, it doesn't mean people don't retain other unlisted rights.
Exactly. And Canense posits that one of those unenumerated fundamental rights is the natural right of an individual to, heal themselves, to access medicine.
So a basic human right to self-medicate, combined with their constitutional interpretations on state recognition and commerce. Wow. It's a multi-pronged approach.
Definitely. And the source notes they didn't just stop at the legal theory. They created something called the Canense Foundation.
Right, alongside the collective itself. What's the foundation for?
Its stated purpose is pretty direct: to provide a solely paid-for legal defense team
For whom?
For any Canense member who runs into legal trouble, harassment, intimidation, actual charges just for possessing or using the medicine they got through the Canense program.
Ah, so it's like legal insurance built into the system.
Kind of. They frame it as giving members a legally defensible position that's actually backed by resources.
Right.
Something an ordinary person facing charges related to cannabis in a restrictive state just wouldn't have on their own.
That legal defense part is significant. It shows that even though they believe their legal arguments are solid,
They anticipate challenges.
yeah, they know members might face pushback from authorities, and they've built in a mechanism to fight that. It acknowledges the risk involved.
Definitely. Now, beyond just the legal framework of how they operate, the source also talks a lot about why someone would want this access, the potential health benefits.
Right, the medical side of things.
Yes, they go into detail about the claimed medical uses. They often contrast cannabis medicine with typical pharmaceuticals.
How so?
The suggestion is that pharmaceuticals often work by, say, blocking a pain signal or treating just a symptom,
Okay.
whereas cannabis, they claim, gets more to the root cause because it interacts directly with the body's own master regulatory system.
Interesting distinction. What specific conditions or benefits does the source say they highlight?
Well, based on the source material, they list quite a range. Things like anti-inflammatory effects, which could help with conditions like fibromyalgia, MS, lupus.
Okay, inflammation is huge.
Yeah. Also, general anti-anxiety effects, potentially useful for PTSD, anxiety, depression. Chronic pain is another big one they mention.
And cancer. That's often mentioned in medical cannabis discussions.
Yes, cancer is mentioned significantly in the source.
What do they claim about it?
They state there are numerous clinical studies they claim over 100 linked on their site showing effects of cannabinoids like THC and CBD on cancer.
What kind of effects?
Well, THC is described as being a powerful anti-inflammatory, but also potentially an anti-cancer agent itself. The claim is it can induce apoptosis, that's programmed cell death, specifically in cancer cells, while leaving healthy cells unharmed.
Okay, that's a major claim. And CBD.
CBD, they suggest, might be less effective at directly killing cancer cells, but it's presented as potentially very effective at stopping cancer from spreading, inhibiting metastasis.
Preventing the spread is critical in cancer treatment.
Absolutely. And all of this, according to the source, ties back to this really fascinating biological concept.
Because
The idea that our own bodies have a system practically designed to interact with compounds from the cannabis plant.
you mean the endocannabinoid system?
Exactly. The ECS. They describe it as this vital network within us that helps keep everything else running smoothly, regulating mood, pain perception, appetite, immune function, memory, tons of stuff.
And we have receptors for these cannabis compounds.
We do. Cannabinoid receptors all over the body and brain. And our bodies even make their own cannabinoids, endocannabinoids.
Right.
So the argument they present is if someone has a deficiency in their own natural endocannabinoids,
They might need to supplement them.
precisely, supplement them with phytocannabinoids, the ones that come from the plant.
So the takeaway from their source is that biologically we're kind of hardwired to interact with this plant.
That's the claim.
And potentially a lack of access to these plant compounds could actually be contributing to illness.
That's the really provocative hypothesis they put forward, that maybe many modern illnesses could be linked, at least in part, to an underlying cannabinoid deficiency.
Caused or worsened by decades of prohibition limiting access to the plant.
That's the implication. It
Yeah.
completely flips the usual script, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's not just cannabis can treat illness, but maybe lack of cannabis access contributes to illness.
Wow. That definitely gives you a lot to mull over regarding the whole history of prohibition and its potential unforeseen consequences.
For sure. The source also touches on the practical side, the different ways people can consume cannabis through their apothecary. It's not just about smoking.
Right. Different delivery methods.
Yeah, they mention a wide variety available online,
Mm-hmm.
which is important because different patients need different things, right?
Depending on the condition, how fast they need relief, dosage control.
Exactly. So they list things like topicals, lotions, creams,
Yeah.
edibles, brownies, drinks, candies.
And oral methods, too.
Yes, things like concentrated oils. They specifically mention Rick Simpson oil, or RSO.
RSO, I've heard of that. It's known for being very potent, right?
Extremely potent. The source describes it as a highly concentrated oil, often used by people dealing with very serious conditions like cancer because of that potency.
How potent are we talking?
Well, the source states that just 1 gram of this RSO concentrate is roughly equivalent to consuming about a 1/4 ounce of dried cannabis flower.
Whoa. Okay.
And they describe a typical regimen, sometimes recommended for cancer patients, involves gradually working up to taking a full gram of that oil per day.
A gram a day.
Yep.
That gives you a sense of the intensity of some of the protocols they're talking about.
It really does. They also brought up an interesting point, challenging the traditional split we make between medical use and recreational use.
Oh, how so?
The argument presented in the source is that, from their biological perspective, all consumption of cannabis is fundamentally medicinal.
All of it, even if someone's just relaxing.
Their reasoning is that because cannabinoids interact with the body's endocannabinoid system, that master regulator we talked about, any intake is supporting and modulating that system. The claim is, essentially, we were biologically designed to interact with this plant, so any use is supporting our biological systems in a way that promotes overall health and balance.
Even if the user isn't consciously targeting a specific diagnosed illness.
Exactly. So, in their view, presented in the source, that distinction between medical and recreational kind of dissolves. It's all interacting with the ECS, therefore it's all technically contributing to health on some level.
That's a philosophical shift as much as a biological one. They also touched briefly on a potential vulnerability in their model, didn't they? The reliance on telemedicine provisions tied to the Affordable Care Act. What if the ACA changes or goes away?
Yeah, they address that concern. Their perspective seems to be that telemedicine as a practice is basically here to stay now.
Regardless of the ACA's specific future.
Right. They see it as having become too embedded, too efficient, too useful, especially for people with serious health issues who find it hard to leave home to just disappear.
That makes sense. It's hard to put the genie back in the bottle once a technology becomes widely adopted and proves its value in healthcare.
And for their specific model, obviously, the stability of telemedicine is absolutely critical. It's the gateway for people across the country to get that initial California recommendation without physically traveling.
So they need it to remain a viable way to connect doctors and patients remotely.
Exactly. They seem confident it will, viewing it as a permanent part of the modern medical landscape, essential for their national reach.
Okay, so wrapping things up here. We've just taken this deep dive into the claims made by this organization, Canense.
Yeah, exploring how they use these specific interpretations of California law, the rise of telemedicine, and some core parts of the U.S. Constitution.
Specifically that full faith and credit clause and a really particular reading of the Commerce Clause.
To argue they can legally provide access to medical cannabis across the entire nation.
And even back it up with a legal defense foundation for their members.
Right. This dive highlighted their whole process, as they describe it, using telemedicine to get that California doctor's recommendation.
Which lets you become a California patient under the Compassionate Use Act, specifically as a member of their collective.
And then accessing their online apothecary, which they claim can legally ship your medication to you, no matter which state you're in.
We also touched on the wide range of health benefits they list in the source.
And that really fascinating biological idea that our bodies are intrinsically designed through the endocannabinoid system to interact with compounds found in cannabis.
So considering the really complex, often very restrictive history of cannabis prohibition in the U.S.
And contrasting that with this emerging information about our own biology, the ECS.
This source really puts forward a thought-provoking perspective, doesn't it?
It really does. It makes you ask, could that long history of prohibition have, perhaps inadvertently, contributed to some of the chronic modern health issues we face? By limiting access to compounds our bodies might actually need or benefit from.
That's a huge question. And then there's the question about their method itself. Does an organization like this, trying to navigate these conflicting laws using constitutional arguments and providing legal backup,
does it represent some kind of potential new pathway? A shift in how access to certain natural medicines might evolve in the future, maybe even bypassing the slow state-by-state legalization process we've seen so far.
It definitely gives you something pretty significant to think about.